Hey, I'm Sage Plays. Welcome back to San Bernardino Zoo, and welcome to our latest arrival, the koala. Yes, we're back in our Australian area, and today we're going to be building a habitat, attempting to get the guests as close as possible to the koalas. The habitat is based on a real one at Taronga Zoo. It's going to take a lot of building, so let's get started. Firstly, we need to do some landscaping around the area to make sure that we've got a nice interesting space to build the habitat in, so it's not all just flat. And while I do that, I will talk a bit about the concept for the habitat. So this habitat is based on the brand new koala habitat at Taronga Zoo. They've got a new Australian area. Taronga Zoo is in Sydney, by the way, if you've not heard of it. They've developed a new area in the zoo specialising in Australian animals, sort of showing their native animals in brand new habitats. It's a really cool area. I saw a shot of the koala habitat a while ago, really liked it, really liked the way they did it, and I've decided to base this habitat on that. This path here is the main path that is going to take people through this area, and the small stone box that you can see above the path is where the koala habitat is going to go. My original concept was that the koalas were going to be part of a walkthrough with wallabies and emus, with the koalas and emus in their own little separate habitats. But when I decided to recreate a part of the Taronga Zoo habitat for the koalas, it didn't make sense to put it in a walkthrough. So we're going to build the wallaby walkthrough next week and just concentrate on the koalas today. So I've placed these 3 eucalyptus feeder trees in. And the reason for doing that is that these are going to enable me to know where the koalas are going to be for quite a lot of the time that they're in the habitat, which is always tricky, knowing where the animals are going to spend their time. But basically every time they get fed, if these are the only feeders in the habitat, then we know we're going to spend a decent amount of time at these points, and we can then build all the guest paths and viewing around them and know that we can get the guests really close to the koala, which is the main sort of concept of this build. So the viewing path that the guests are going to take to this habitat is going to be raised. So once we finish with the terrain, we'll drop a piece of path in using shift and control so we can put it exactly where we want, just under this little dude here. And then we'll start making the path itself. So we want a straight path up in the air to run alongside the habitat. And then we will join it on to the more natural looking path that runs past it. That gives the guest the choice of whether they go up into this habitat or if they walk past it, if they're going to the next area of the zoo or the wallaby walkthrough, wherever it is they're going. You need choices as to where they're going to walk, basically. And then we're going to start decorating the path. So we're going to use this wooden path here, put some railings in, and then we're going to have a completely custom path. All the railings, all the concrete underneath the path, everything is going to be custom, which takes some doing, but it's really worth it when it's finished. And I want to recreate the look of the Taronga Zoo habitat as well as the way it works. So we're going to use this metal fence piece to start filling in the gaps in the railings. And then I'm going to use these pieces from the Twilight pack as a sort of measure so that I can make sure each metal pole is exactly the same distance away from the one next to it, all the way along the path. And then once we've got that in there and done this section, we can just delete the extra bits that we don't need. And we've got a nice even railing there. And then we can start copying it all the way along this path. Down the curves at the end, we're going to have to do a lot of adjustments to each individual piece to get it to fit in perfectly. It takes a long time, but when it's finished, it's definitely worth it. I really like the way this looks when it's finished. Need to do some adjustments to the height as well as it goes up and down. And then we end up with this, which is starting to look good already. And next up, we're going to cover up the sides and the underside of the path with some more Australian looking pieces so we can get away from the sort of in-game raised path look and sit this in nicely to our Australian area. While I do that, I want to give a massive shout out to one of you guys, Rory, who's just been to Taronga Zoo and sent me a huge amount of photos of the new Australian area that I could use for reference. They've been so useful. I think I only had like one shot of the koala habitat, and now I've got lots of shots of that habitat and the surrounding area. And we're going to be doing our best to make this build look as close as possible to the real thing, within the limits, of course, of the fact that we're in franchise mode. I also want to say a big thank you to Validark and Jennifer Atherton, who sent me through some recommendations for various Australian landscapes and places in Australia to check out so we can get the sort of Australian forest vibe that we're going for here. Like I said, when we built the entrance to this area, I really want to get away from that outback kind of look for this area, except for the actual outback habitat that we're going to have at the other side of the area to where we are here. More on that in the coming weeks. Let's move on to the viewing galleries for the guests. We're going to place 3 little offshoots of the path here, taking care to get them exactly spaced away from each other. And then we're going to make the final adjustment to the trees so that they can get them as close as possible to where the guests are going to be standing. Now I need to run the habitat barrier in front of these bits of path so the guests don't think they're inside the habitat, because that is not going to be good in game. And then we'll just get the trees as close as possible. Then we're going to start building some little shelters for each area. I'm kind of mindful of the fact there's not a lot of shade in this zoo, which in Southern California isn't brilliant, so I'm trying to get more in. And this is also exactly what they have in the Taronga Zoo, or almost exactly. We're going to build these here, one for each of the little viewing galleries. Now, these go through about 10 different color changes before I'm happy with them, and end up just making them all black, which matches Taronga Zoo, and it just looks really sort of classy. Decided to get rid of the Australian artwork on it, and then we'll put some more of these rusted metal poles in as stands for each area. And then we'll move on to the perimeter fence. So I'm going to base these on the motif that we used in the entrance with the cassowary pieces, and then turn them into an actual fence. So I'm using loads of the pieces from the Australia pack here to make these look like they are actually sort of fixed into the ground. We're going to use a sign, we're going to use some of the little hinges, as always, to nail these supports into the cassowary piece, and then we're going to use some brackets as well so it looks like they are properly supported and would actually stand up. Don't know how sort of solid you need to make walls to keep koalas in, but better safe than sorry. And with one piece completed, we can now move on to turning this into an actual fence. So we're going to copy a couple of these and then start running them all the way around the habitat. I want it to be a really irregular shape, so it's going to follow the quite natural looking paths that are going around it, to keep away from having any sort of squares or rectangles or anything like that. It's a real riot of different designs and colours, this fence, which I think is really nice. There's the shelters with the correct roof colour at last. It looks a lot classier like that. Let's move on to the inside of the habitat and start taking care of that. We're going to have some climbing first of all. So for reasons known only to Frontier, the enrichment feeders, despite being trees, don't count as climbing. Not sure why that is. The koalas climb them, but it doesn't fill any of their climbing needs. So we need some more climbing in here as well to make sure that they're happy. And we need a shelter as well. I'm not going to spend too long on this. It's going to be hidden away at the back of the habitat behind a load of foliage. So we're just going to have something really simple in here. One of the concepts I want to try and achieve with the habitat is, because the koalas in the game don't spend nearly enough time climbing for my liking, I basically want it so that you can't see them or they're climbing, and as little time as possible walking around on the floor. So this shelter is going to have some of their enrichment in it and some additional climbing, and hopefully they'll spend most of their time either in the shelter or up on the enrichment feeders and the extra climbing that we've put in at the front. So you either see them doing what koalas do, or you don't see them at all, which is what you'd see in a real zoo, rather than having them just sort of running about on the floor all the time. Frontier have improved that. I can't remember what update it was, but at some point they made them climb more, which is great. But they could definitely do it even more than they do at the moment. And then we're going to use this cassowary piece one more time to make the front of the shelter more interesting. It will be hidden behind the foliage most of the time, but you can see it a bit, so we want it to look good. And then it's time for Franchise Masters. So one of the things I struggled with most when I first started playing Planet Zoo was doors and windows. The way that the door and window decoration pieces don't go onto the door pieces, they go onto the wall pieces, and then they stick out, especially the windows. It looks really weird. Windows never stick out from buildings. So how do you fix that? You use panels. What you do is you take the panel pieces from the same set as whatever you're building with, and then use those to fill in the space around the window. It's best if you use plaster or concrete walls, then you don't get the sort of mismatched lines that I'm getting here, and then you can delete the wall piece behind it, and it all sits in nicely like that. Back to the habitat, and you may have noticed that the floor of this habitat is this giant lump of weird looking terrain. The reason for that is because you're not going to see hardly any of it. The floor of this habitat is going to be made predominantly of concrete. Now, normally zoos don't use concrete floors very much these days because they tend to be bad for animals' feet, but with a koala, it's fine because they spend pretty much all their time sat in a tree. They hardly ever actually touch the floor, so they're never going to be in contact with it long enough to get any of the sort of foot problems that some animals get when you use concrete floors. And this, I believe, is what they've got in Taronga Zoo. That's what it looks like anyway. You've got areas of concrete and then areas of earth, and that's where the trees are either planted or placed. And that's what I want to replicate here. It is going to take some doing to get these sort of circles of concrete and then other plaster panels and basically replace the whole floor because it's uneven, and I want it to stay uneven because that makes it look more interesting. So we're going to be placing possibly more plaster than I've ever placed, and that is a lot of plaster all the way around this habitat, leaving little gaps for where the trees are going to be. And then once we've got the shape sort of roughed out and I'm happy with how it's looking and we've got enough of it covered and a good basic shape to the habitat, then we're going to go in and add detail to stop it from looking like loads of plaster panels basically. So we're going to have some ramps going up and down from the main area here. This ramp here makes sure that if the koalas trot down here, which is unlikely, they wouldn't be able to get out of the habitat and climb up into the viewing areas. And then we'll do the same thing on the other side with a much gentler slope so they can get from the shelter to the trees. Let's take a look at what we've got so far. Starting to look really interesting, but also kind of messy. So we've got a lot of fixing to do. Let's get started with that. Firstly, any visible gaps between the plaster panels are going to be covered up with these grunge decals, which also make it look much more natural as well, which is really useful. So we'll put one in there, and we'll put some larger ones here, and just go all the way around, covering up any gaps that need covering. We'll put that other ramp in that I mentioned so that they can get into the habitat from the back. A few more decals, and then I'm not happy with how the edges of the concrete looks. It's not smooth enough, so we'll make a really nice smooth circle and drop that in. And then it's on to the final part of the build, getting it to work. So we need a hell of a lot of climbing in here for the koalas, and we need to make sure that they can actually climb it, which is easier said than done. So everything looks the way I want it to look. Now it's time to start adding in extra climbing pieces to make sure that they can get from the floor up to the climbing areas, and just continually going in and out of the traversable area view so that we can see how it's working. We'll put some enrichments in the shelter like I mentioned earlier, just to make sure that they're going to spend time in there when they're on the floor and maximize the amount of time they spend climbing outside of the shelter. And then speaking of climbing, we need quite a bit more than I thought we would. So I'm going to add something in which is based on what we built in the treetop trail for the orangutans, which is this sort of custom climbing thing. It's based on what we did there, but it's going to be more koala sized, so it needs to be a lot smaller. So we're just going to rotate a load of these wood pieces from the Twilight Pack until we've got a little platform, and then we can move it up on top of the structure that we just built and put it into the habitat, and that should satisfy all the koalas' climbing needs. While I finish that off, just a bit of a channel update. So I said right at the start of this year that I was going to stop my Wednesday videos so that I could concentrate entirely on making San Bernardino Zoo and making sure I get a really good episode out every Saturday. And I'm very happy that I made that decision. But I have managed to improve my workflow slightly with San Bernardino Zoo. It still takes just as long to build each habitat, but in terms of editing and voicing, I'm pretty much getting those done in a day now, which means I've actually got a bit more time. So from now on, there should be a lot more Wednesday videos on the channel. We had the Moonlight World Tour on Wednesday. I hope you enjoyed that. And you can look out for more zoo tours coming soon from some of my favorite creators, starting, I think, this Wednesday with one that I think you are really going to enjoy. That is the habitat done. Let's check it out. Here's the guest side of the habitat. You can see the backs of the viewing galleries here where they can see the koalas. And here are the occupants. I've had two koalas sat in my trade centre since I built London Zoo 1985, or rather when I converted it from a franchise zoo to a sandbox zoo. These poor guys have been sat in a trade centre for like 2 years, but it was finally time to get them out into a brand new zoo, seeing as I never found room for them in Tekton Zoo. So it was great to get them in here, and I think one of them was pregnant, so we've got a little baby koala already, which is good. We've got a little enrichment item for them down here. This is the only enrichment outside of the shelter. And then this is the main event, the feeding. So it took a lot of work to get this, but once I got it right, they are about as close to the guests as I can get them, and the view from here is pretty good when they're eating, and they are absolutely adorable, of course. I haven't seen a koala since I was about 10 or 11, I think. They are pretty rare outside Australia in zoos, despite how popular they are, mainly because they are so expensive to feed, because they only eat eucalyptus. They're quite fragile as well. They get a lot of health problems, so it is difficult to keep them in zoos, which is why you mainly see them in Australian zoos. But I'm really happy with the final look of this habitat, especially the concrete. It took a lot of work, but I think it was worth it. Let's take a look at where we started today and where we are now. I really hope you enjoyed that. Next week, we're going to be building the Wallaby walkthrough. Looking forward to that. I will see you then. Thanks for watching. Bye.